Welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hello, this is Tom Thurston, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Stephanie Redden. Dr. Redden got her PhD in political science with a specialization in political economy at Carleton University in Ontario. Her dissertation was titled "The Feminization of the Everyday, Examining the Gendered Nature of Worker Resistance within the transnational call center industry." And since July of last year, she's been our modern-day slavery and human trafficking fellow, and has been working on, I guess, what came from your dissertation, or certainly grew out of your dissertation, and but is focused really on incarcerated call centers, or at least this particular chapter that you've been talking about has been. So I wonder if you could begin. First of all, it's great having you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, Tom.
And but I wonder if you could start maybe by just talking a little about call centers in general, who we all come in touch with, but I don't think many of us think about much.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's something that we're all familiar with. We all deal with, maybe not on a daily basis, but certainly a regular enough basis, getting telemarketing calls or calling for customer service assistance to a 1-800 number or such. And so it's something we're all familiar with, but I don't think it's something that we necessarily think about that reflexively about who's on the other end of the phone when we're engaging in those phone calls. And so my dissertation, as you noted, was really looking at the transnational call center more generally. This project is looking at incarcerated call center employees. But in general, the transnational call center industry is largely staffed by female call center employees, about 70%
Right.
worldwide. Numbers around this are a little bit difficult to ascertain, but that seems to be the last number that I was able to find about the industry more broadly. It's largely ununionized labor, so it's an industry where it's very much transnationally situated, where companies can easily, not overnight, but can easily move from place to find cheaper labor and
Right.
more controllable labor. So there's a huge threat of capital flight that keeps collective organization within the industry at bay. Not entirely. There are certainly cases where transnational call center workers have been successfully unionized through other unions, but largely it's an environment where resistance is pretty constrained.
Right. So you mentioned that it's overwhelmingly women who are working at these centers, and part, I assume, is simple economics. But you also make an argument about how this is, how and why this is feminized work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my making that case is certainly not novel. It's building on Arlie Hochschild's work on emotional labor, and I'm not the first person writing in the context of call centers to do that, but it is important to make that link. So there's gendered tropes, tropes and understandings around what skills are natural for women and why they make quote unquote better call center employees,
Right.
because women are seen through their roles as mothers and as caretakers in general as being more emotionally invested, nurturing, caring, and so forth. So it de-skills the labor to a certain extent within the industry, which also brings down the price of the labor.
And I mean, considering how I assume it is incredibly inexpensive to set up, what is pushing the call centers to relocate or locate in the United States, and especially within prison populations?
So a big part of the story is the outsourcing that's happened over the last at least 20 years, a bit more than that in some cases. And so there were, in many cases, backlashes that came from largely American customers where they weren't happy with talking with who they perceived to be foreign call center employees in India, Malaysia, other places. So there was a move to reshore labor. So that happened both in the context of call center work being brought back to the U.S., but also being brought to Canada, because Canadians sort of seen as the friendly neighbor to the U.S.
Right.
The cultural context is very similar. In terms of accent training, it's not necessary. But then in terms of the prison call center population, it is part of this reshoring trend where, and as I talked about in the brown bag lecture, the government materials that are marketing this type of unfree labor are very clear about presenting it as offshore labor at onshore labor at offshore prices. Right. So they're being sold as a nearshore alternative where they don't have to undergo accent training necessarily, and they're familiar with the cultural context of customers.
I'm going to reveal my age a little, but when I used to think about prison labor, it's like making license plates. And in fact, a lot of unions really pushed that, we don't want imprisoned workers to be competing against unionized labor. And so there was this kind of push towards governmental. This kind of work isn't. When did that aspect of work in the prison begin to shift? Was there some kind of
Yeah, full disclaimer, I'm fairly new to researching the area of prison labor.
Okay.
So my interest in call center prison labor came out of a broader interest with transnational call center work. The move towards operating call centers within prison setting, I'm Canadian. In the Canadian case, there were examples in the 90s, so pretty much when the call center industry took off in general.
Right.
So I think in certain cases from the very beginning, there was a move to see how can we utilize quote-unquote cheap labor, available cheap labor.
Right, and how are they, they're marketing that in a whole lot of different ways. Making the point that you have a captive workforce in, a very real sense. What are the kind of economics, the kind of individual, personal economics of the business? People are paid hourly, and does it go into a prison?
Yeah, from all accounts, and I certainly can't speak generally across experiences of all prison call centers, but there does seem to be a hierarchy of prison labor within the prison setting. So certain jobs are more desirable than others, and prison call center labor, by all accounts, is one of the more desirable positions. It pays more. It certainly doesn't pay nearly as much as, in many cases, call center employees would be paid outside of a prison context. Right. And then I've read some things where part of that wage that they receive goes directly to them while they're in prison. Part of it is taken away to cover their room and board costs as a prisoner, and then the other part, if there's anything left over, would go into a savings account that they could access once they're released. But there's really varying accounts about how much people are being paid, right, and then how that's allocated to them.
Right, and I assume that just follows with all imprisoned labor is going to be in the same kind of situation of having to pay back a certain amount and being left with little. As you were mentioning, you have this in thinking about transnational call centers. You've kind of thought a lot about that, and you also, though, are including this imprisoned population as being a part of that transnational system. Could you say a little more about how that functions?
Yeah, sure. So I made a very conscious decision when talking about and writing about the prison call center industry to make sure that it was clear that it was transnational in nature, because the price and desirability of prison call center labor is very much tied to labor in other countries. So not necessarily in a direct competition sense, but in some ways a direct competition sense in terms of like labor pricing as well as acceptability. And by acceptability, I mean the acceptability by a very generalizable American public about who they want to talk to when they talk to people on the phone.
Right.
So you can't divorce prison call center labor from a broader transnational experience of call center labor. Because the moves to incorporate prison labor in the U.S. have very much been tied to, as I mentioned earlier, this move to reshore or wanting to keep labor in a very culturally similar arena.
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned you were talking about there's a term I think that you kind of use, emotive femininity, and how that in some ways defines the kind of call center, the interaction between the caller and the called. But of course, in an environment in a prison, how does the dynamics of like kind of gendering the work to begin with, but also issues of race and everything else that kind of goes into how you create the perfect caller at a call center. How does that kind of work in this environment?
So this has been something I've been fundamentally intrigued by since starting this research. In general, as you mentioned, the sort of idea of the trope of emotive femininity, which again speaks to Arlie Hochschild's work around emotional labor, but in the call center industry, it's very much operationalized by capital in caring for customers over the phone.
Right.
And so because of that trope of emotive femininity, women have in general terms been the most desirable form of the call center employee. And so you have this curious case where, in my mind, you would be able to choose to a certain extent which prisons you would set these call centers up in.
Yeah.
But you have them being set up in both men's and women's prisons. And so I haven't been able to ascertain, and I think that's only going to come out if I'm able to interview prison officials and prison call center employers directly about what went into the decision. Like why do you have them being set up in men's prisons? Because for me, it's understandable that they're in women's prisons. It's problematic.
Fits a model.
Yeah, it's problematic, but it's understandable. Now, when you have them being set up in men's prisons, it's a question of, and that's where race comes in. Is it feminizing a black labor? Is it not that all call center employees in men's prisons would be black, but certainly.
But there's a history of that.
Yeah. So it's looking at, the gendered racialization, which is a term that comes from the sort of broader literature on call centers, and looking at how that's playing, and that's in the context of like Indian call centers, and seeing how maybe that's playing out in the American case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really one of the most fascinating parts of it, and it does kind of. It would be wonderful to be able to get those prison officials and the like to do, and of course that's a tough. Have you been able to talk to any former imprisoned call center workers?
I haven't been able to speak to anybody yet, and that's been the big struggle with this project is just getting access to talk to people that have some familiarization, firsthand knowledge and experience with this industry. So I haven't completely given up, but I'm still attempting to be able to talk to and potentially visit prisons where this is happening. And I'm very much still in the process of getting approval from prison call center sites to be able to do that.
That's your next kind of set of steps that you're taking?
Well, it's been it started when I started the fellowship early, actually. Made the conscious decision to do that because I knew that getting ethics clearance to work with a vulnerable population was going to take longer. I have some experience in the past dealing with more complicated ethical reviews, so I know it can be a time-intensive process. And so I came early for that reason, and it's been ongoing since I arrived last July. I have approval to be able to do that research, but then gaining access and approval on the side of the prison is a different question.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Historians don't usually have to
No.
about those kind of issues. Can I ask, you talk, a lot of your work's about everyday resistance. First of all, in the kind of larger context, how does one kind of, resist? How does one throw a shoe into the machinery, that sort of thing?
Well, so I can speak, I guess, in more depth to transnational call centers in general. I am less familiar, and that's part of this project, is wanting to see what resistance looks like in a prison call center setting. Although it's a trickier question to explore in that context, given the even more prevalent surveillance and monitoring than you have, which is already pretty intense in a non-incarcerated prison call center setting. So for me, when I did my doctoral research, I found a number of different strategies. And so you had, to speak to the trope of emotive femininity, you had the withdrawal of emotional labor. So the refusal to sort of nurture and care for customers over the phone, which is the expected norm of like how you interact with customers. Also acts of creativity. So, and this goes back to the sort of identity work that goes into call center labor in general. And one of the interview participants, talked about how, and they had a sort of non-standard, I would say, Canadian or American name. And so they would start out by saying hi and then say their actual name. And they didn't disguise their name, but oftentimes people would either mishear or mispronounce, or they almost never get it correct. So this person sort of creatively took that on and would come up with different personas. So based on whatever they would be called. So if they were like called Natalie, then Natalie would be vivacious. She would be flirtatious. And so they would embody whoever it is that this customer had named them. So, so lots of different ways. They're also, more in terms of economics, there were forms of resistance that really did have the potential to impact companies' bottom line over time. So I talked to someone who, through the interviews, worked for a credit card company and refused to charge interest fees, so they wouldn't collect them. Now, they knew they were going to be leaving that call center within a period of a few months. So they were a little bit more freer to like actually do things than somebody that's and this is part of the social positionality of resisting, right? It depends on, who you are. It depends on, do you have dependents? Are you there? Are you a working mother who requires, who may have an immigrant mother who may have a hard time finding other employment? So that really plays into how people choose to resist.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine. And I can also imagine how difficult it is. Especially as you mentioned, in the kind of overly surveilled kind of nature, even in the private sector, of kind of being clocked, having all your stats kind of released every week or every day, just monitoring you constantly, that in a prison environment, that's got to be even more. Although, as you say, it's simply the idea of assuming a persona, of playing a role as a call center worker, is an act of creativity and is a way of kind of making you have some kind of control over the environment. You're here as our modern slavery and human trafficking fellow, and at least to me, and I'm sure the listeners, we can kind of see why. But it does kind of beg the question: is it how does this compare with other forms of unfree labor, and especially, just the kind of marketing side of it?
Yeah, so I've really been interested by the question of looking at comparisons with how unfree labor has been marketed in other historical contexts. In particular, I've really been focusing in on how slave labor was marketed in antebellum America. So not necessarily by the state, which is the case with prison labor today, marketing it to private companies. But looking in general at the language and the modes of marketing that were involved. And so as I talked about earlier, there are sort of marketing brochures and marketing materials online that prison call center or prisons have been using. So, for example, Federal Prison Industries, or UNICOR, which is the body that's involved with regulating federal prison labor, has recently sort of been able to market their labor to private companies, which in the past they wouldn't have been able to. And so they've been sort of selling this labor, if you will, on the open market. And so the way that they're coaching that in terms of like cheap highly secured labor, and just the language that they use in describing that labor, and then comparing that with the sort of language and modes of advertisement used in antebellum America to market slaves. I've seen an overlap, and it's something I'm just beginning to explore, but I think there's certainly something there.
And I mean, could you be more specific? Like, what are some of the kind of ways they're kind of portraying this workforce that they're selling?
Well, they're portraying it in a sense that, like, this is work that's it's a benefit to the prisoners themselves, and saying, like, this is something that's good for them, and like we're doing a service to prisoners essentially by providing this labor that's being, not paid in the same way that they would be paid if it were outside of the prison context. And then also just the language around security and like highly controllable labor, and some of it is more implicit, but some of it is pretty explicit. And so I showed during the brown bag lecture that I gave at the GLC. You can really pull out, it's not hard to find in these marketing materials, ways that this labor is being sold as like highly exploitable, highly secured, no turnover,
Right.
no low absenteeism.
All sorts of benefits.
Yeah, all sorts of benefits
Yeah.
to having this type of labor be part of your company's operations. And now that's not to say that like it's an exact replica of what we have when you're marketing slave labor in antebellum America. I'm not making that case. I'm just saying that there does seem to be historical connections and in the ways and language that this type of labor is being marketed. I think one conversation I had with Lou DeBaca, who's
Right.
another fellow at the GLC, the senior fellow at the GLC, and then David Blight, who's obviously the director of the GLC. And this is when I first had the seed of this idea of doing this historical comparison. And I'm not an historian by training. So I was sort of nervous, and I was like, oh, is there something here? And I wanted to talk through it with them. And, and David was very much about like, go forth, be bold, do that work. It's, go for it. But he was also saying like, and I think it might be a Mark Twain quote about history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
Right.
And so that's very much something I'm cognizant of, right? It doesn't look exactly the same, but
it's not a one-to-one.
It's not a one-to-one comparison. It's a different,
right,
obviously different context, and also different players at the table here.
Right.
So we're talking about state marketing of prison labor.
Right.
But in any case, and this is something Lou sort of pointed out, in both cases, it's labor that shouldn't be on the market. It shouldn't be sold on the market.
Right.
This is not labor that should be available.
Right.
So in the way that it's available.
Right. I mean, in thinking of forced labor and unforced labor, it just doesn't fit into a kind of labor freely given, contracts freely entered into. It seems very. I mean, it's not to say that one can't, put down their foot and say I'm not going to do that, but options are so limited. And then again, it's like it's their social condition that in some way is being marketed as like the benefits to employees in a way I think that is very true for selling enslaved people, is that it's the very fact of their enslavement that is really being sold. So I see it's really, and I think it fits into a larger critique that maybe you could address on mass incarceration. And in fact, how do you see? Is there a way, another way of understanding mass incarceration through this dynamic that you're talking about?
It's something because I'm new to this area of research, and that's not sort of an excuse of not having a fully formed answer. But since I started here, I've been part of a racial capitalism and the carceral state working group, which is, I believe, sort of based and came out of African American studies here at Yale. But it's a multidisciplinary group, and so I've been exploring a lot of the literature around mass incarceration in the U.S., racial capitalism, and for me, it's helped me get my head around the context, the ongoing evolution of mass incarceration in the U.S., and certainly the very problematic and troubling aspects of it. And so how does my work fit into that? I think it sheds a light on actual day-to-day realities of people that are a part of part and parcel of this
Right.
mass incarceration, and looking at how things are sort of messy and not black and white. And so you have a case where, by all open accounts, this is labor that gives skills training and
Right.
like employment training to people that are behind bars that they can then operationalize and make use of once they're not in prison.
Right.
And so, you know,
Is there any evidence of that?
do I have any hard evidence of that? No, but I'm highly skeptical of that. I mean,
Right.
not that there aren't gaining certain experiences and skills from that, but in terms of employability after leaving prison, Televerde, which operates in prisons in Arizona and Indiana, has been the sort of most, I would say, public-facing prison call center company, and they make the sort of strong claims that they, they're the most vocal about, like, oh, we're helping the prisoners that are involved in our company, but then also, like, they'll have the opportunity to work for us after they're out. And so I don't have numbers on that. So it would be, I am interested to see how that actually translates in that move from being a prisoner to being free.
To see if these skills are going to be usable,
transferable. And so it's, I mean, it's a hard thing to track.
Right.
But it is an interesting.
Yeah, and I should also add that even though this is kind of your business, it shouldn't be you who has to be tracking this stuff.
No.
That information,
Yeah.
should be coming from the government, Bureau of Corrections or whatever in some way or another. And I think in my mind, one of the kind of like biggest eye-openers to me is that there's a whole of the federal government that is in the business of essentially selling this resource that they have in a way that, as you mentioned, in like the under slavery, there was nothing comparable to that. It's like federalizing this business, incarcerated business. Or workforce is really kind of amazing to me.
Yeah, so that move on in terms of just talking about Unicor or Federal Prison Industries, goes by both names. It's been a fairly recent turn that they've been able to market, in particular, call center labor to private companies, and they do so. Or they're only able to do so with the agreement that the labor that they're contracting out would have gone to companies outside of the U.S. So if they can show, and I don't know how they are able to do that, that the labor that's going to prison call center workers would otherwise be overseas, then they're able to take that on. And previous to that, it was the case that, and it still is the case, that Federal Prison Industries deals a lot with producing materials and services for within the prison industrial complex. So they do stuff within the prisons. So they're producing, like, as far as I know, uniforms. And Lewis pointed out that, there's a history of them being used to make office supplies. And things of that nature. So I think it's been more recent. And I know, at least for the case of the call center employees, that like that's something that wouldn't have been happening up until, in the last few years.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you know or not, but do you know like specific products that have been marketed using imprisoned labor?
I don't have an exact list now. There's some, if you look at some of the materials that have been produced, some of the sort of news or media reports around Televerde, they list a number of top international companies that we would all be familiar with that have, I don't know, speculatively, if not actually, been involved in that. But it's really a broad spectrum of types of call center labor that are being performed. So, for example, you'll have prison call center workers doing DMV work. Calling in to a DMV customer service line, and they would be talking to prisoners. Then you also had, and I talked about this in the brown bag lecture, where you have prisoners manning tourism hotlines, which is a very bizarre,
very bizarre, ironic.
Very bizarre, problematic case, and prisoners, the sort of excerpts from the media reports on that are telling, where they're talking about the irony of being prisoners, telling people how to travel. and not obviously being able to do so themselves. So it isn't just one type of call or interaction. It's a broad array of different types of labor that's happening.
So what in moving forward on your project, and as I said, you're here for a year, and it's been wonderful having you. But what are some of the next steps that you plan to take with the project? Do you have kind of a pathway outlined?
So the really big thing that the last big thing I'm hoping to accomplish, well, I guess there's two, but the one big one before I leave, after having worked this hard to secure ethics clearance, is to be able to actually get out in the field while I'm still here. And that's not really in my hands, but I'm still, actively fighting to try to make that happen. But then the other thing is really exploring the historical archives at the Beinecke around the American slave trade. And so I've already dabbled a bit in that, and so I got a little bit lost as a non-historian. I had this conversation with Lou and one of our new associates, Amanda, and just like the sort of self-consciousness of being a non-historian, starting to work with historical documents and just feeling lost. And there's so much. But I was able to find actually some really interesting, helpful materials. But going forward, I've worked with a curator at the Beinecke who specializes in this area. And so I've got a lot of material to go through before I leave.
Well, I'll have to say, coming from the historian side of the conversation, and I think I speak for a lot of us, it's really exciting to see someone who's doing contemporary work, whether it's around mass incarceration or around call centers or all these kind of new emerging technologies. It's just that it's really exciting to see, especially when people begin to take a historical take on the subject. It's just a wonderful kind of interdisciplinary kind of approach, and it's as you obviously know just from the questions that came about after your brown bag lecture. We're really fascinated in this work, and it's been super great having you as a part of the center. And which I should say, when this is being recorded, it's still February in 2020, so she's not leaving tomorrow. But before in kind of concluding, are there some books or resources that you'd recommend to people who are interested in this subject, both broadly and kind of narrowly?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with my sort of foundational text in understanding gender, resistance, and so forth, and then maybe a more specific recommendation around understanding unfree labor. So for me, the work of Cynthia Enloe, and there's many different books and articles that Enloe's produced that are brilliant around the question of gender and linking the everyday life to the international. I'm an international political economist. I don't know that. So not an historian, feminist international political economist. And so for me, Enloe's work has been really foundational in understanding how gendered power relations and gendered hierarchies play out and are connected to international politics and the global political economy. If I had to pick one text, it would be The Curious Feminist. It's something that every time I teach, I always assign the introductory chapter to that, because it really challenges students, and it still challenges me as a scholar to not be lazy and to ask the question. So not take something like a term like cheap labor as something that's given, or globalization, things like this that we just take and we don't critically examine, because it takes a lot of work.
Right.
So to instead move from cheap labor to labor made cheap, and really unpack that. So for me, I wouldn't be able to answer this question without saying Cynthia Enloe. The other, and we've talked about this before, is James C. Scott's work on everyday forms of resistance. Obviously, you can obviously see how it's been important for my work, but understanding how people resist in controlled situations, and really valuing those forms of resistance apart from any broader or larger political movement. And so I mean, it is important, but it's not the only thing that's important in looking at those types of agency. Yeah. And so Weapons of the Week, that's James C. Scott's Weapons of the Week, has been pivotal in my work, and that's both Enloe and Scott's work carry over into the work that I'm doing now and my understandings of resistance and gender in the prison call center setting. Now, to more specific recommendation around unfree labor, I will give a plug to another former GLC associate, Genevieve LeBaron.
Oh, yes, of course.
And so I've really been drawing a lot, at least initially, and trying to get my head around sort of choices that prisoners have. And this, she talks about, I think, a spectrum of labor and freedom in one of her articles where she looks at unfree labor. And that's been very helpful for me in trying to like get my head around how prison call center labor is experienced on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Those all sound like great recommendations. And as I said, your work's really fascinating, and I think really important, too, for a lot of the struggles that people are engaged in these days. As I said, you're not leaving anytime soon.
No, you're not getting rid of me tomorrow.
But in the interest of the podcast, I just want to say it's been great having you here, and I'm really looking forward to continuing intellectual conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And just like a final thank you to the GLC for making this research possible. It's been a real dream to be able to come back and really expand on the work that I started with my dissertation.
Slavery and Its Legacies is brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a part of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Additional support is provided by the Robina Foundation, and production support is provided by the Yale Broadcast Center. For more information about the Gilder Lehrman Center, its activities, and this podcast, visit glc.yale.edu.